Now, even though we've left it for last, the NDB approach was actually one of the first electronic instrument approach procedures to be developed. Now, every approach aid you've looked at so far tells you something about where you are. Well, the NDB just says, "Here I am," and it leaves it up to you to figure out where you are. Well, not surprisingly, you'll find NDB approaches usually have the highest minimums of all the approaches you'll shoot. Now, with all the modern day avionics available, I can hear you wondering, why do I have to learn NDB approaches? Well, it's simple. The NDB approach is the approach of last resort. When all the modern goodies have gone in the tank, the NDB could be your lifeline. Plus, if you can fly an NDB approach, you'll have access to a lot of the smaller airports in the U.S., even if the GPS satellite system or your GPS receiver has problems. Besides, think of the bragging rights. Successfully completing an NDB approach entitles you to an aerial merit badge that signifies that you can think and fly at the same time. Now, everything you've already learned about the way VOR approaches are set up also applies with NDB approaches, because NDB approaches may use a transmitter that could be located anywhere around the airport, and the transmitter might just do double duty as both an initial approach fix and the final approach fix, just as VORs can. And step-down fixes can be identified with VOR radials, marker beacons, even DME. Radar, of course, can be used as a substitute. You've seen all that before. Now, I didn't mention GPS for an obvious reason. If a GPS approach were available and operational, you'd use that instead of the NDB approach, because a GPS approach is much more accurate. And a great many of the NDB approaches in the United States do have a GPS overlay approach. But once again, think of your NDB as your fallback position. You'll generally use it because other approach options are not available. Now, everything you've already learned about self-briefing and approach setup still applies here. Not much new here either, but there are a couple gentle reminders. The only indication of NDB failure is the audio signal, so you'll have to listen to the ADF all the way through the entire approach. And as you've learned before, an ADF bearing is only as good as the match between your heading indicator and the ADF card. Now, if they don't have the same number at the top, you're just reading numbers, but not bearings. Now, with those caveats disposed of, let's take a quick look at some of the examples of the various NDB approach configurations. Now, this approach at Trenton, New Jersey is typical of an NDB approach where it's configured so that the transmitter and the final approach course are both on the same side of the airport. And by the way, it uses an outer compass locator of the ILS, and you'll find that nearly every ILS that has an outer compass locator will also have an NDB approach. Now, this particular approach has two marker beacons, the outer marker and the middle marker, and these help verify your progress, and the middle marker helps alert you to the proximity of the missed approach point. Now, the missed approach point on this approach, like on most non-precision approaches, is determined by timing the approach. Now, on this particular approach, notice that you'll be flying away from the NDB as you fly towards the airport. This means that you'll be using the somewhat more challenging flying technique of pulling the tail of the needle with you to make corrections. Now, let's take a look at this approach at Fredericksburg, Virginia. By the way, this is the lazy pilot's favorite type of approach. As you might guess, that appeals to me a lot. Now, the reason this is the lazy pilot's favorite is the NDB is right smack dab on the airport, and that means as you fly towards the airport, the needle points to the airport the entire way. It makes it a lot easier to end up right smack dab on the airport. Now, just like one of the VOR approaches you saw earlier, this hardworking little NDB does it all. It's the initial approach fix as you fly towards the NDB for the first time. It's the missed approach point, and it's also the missed approach holding fix. You know what? The taxpayers got their money's worth on this one. Now, an interesting sidelight, if you take a look at it, is the presence of the Brook VOR over here. And yes, there is a straight-in VOR approach to this airport using Brook. However, the Brook VOR is just about 6 miles from the airport, and the VOR has a minimum descent altitude of 1,600 feet. But the NDB approach uses the NDB, which is right smack dab on top of the airport, and it has a minimum descent altitude of 1,100 feet. In other words, you can actually go 500 feet lower on the NDB approach than on the VOR approach. So in this case, this creaky old NDB approach we saw earlier would clearly be the preferred approach. Now, as another example, let's consider this approach to runway 14 at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And by the way, this almost certainly is not going to be your first choice for an approach. Look at that mess. You can see it's really interesting here. We've got restricted areas and so on. But the thing we really want to point out is that this approach has a beacon on the opposite side of the airport from the final approach course. And the unusual thing about this approach is that you can see from the title, DME is required to shoot the approach. Now, how do you get the DME readout? Well, this channel number right here tells you what you have to do is tune your nav radio to the localizer frequency to get the paired DME channel. Now, you might be just chuckling to yourself at this point and say, well, if I have a localizer, why don't we just use the localizer? Well, that localizer may not be working. And even though you tune the DME by setting in the localizer frequency, the localizer receiver and DME in your airplane are completely independent of each other. So it's entirely possible for the DME to be working even when the localizer is out of service. And if the localizer is out of service, this NDB DME approach may become your approach of last resort. Well, that gives you a pretty good sample of the variety you'll find in the realm of NDB approaches. Now, NDBs may be creaky old devices and perhaps not all that accurate, but when all else fails, they just might be your ticket to a safe arrival.